Okay, so good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I'd like to welcome you to the official stats section where we're going to be looking at challenges and insights into small island statistics. Now, this session came around, I think I was at a conference last year, and in one of the talks I just heard someone mention about an island. I thought, do you know what, we don't really hear about small island statistics, and I think they're absolutely fascinating. So I'm proud to say we've got a really great lineup of presenters today going to be talking about small island statistics, some of their challenges and how we work with that type of data. So our first presenter today is Paula McLeod, currently working at DFID, but she's going to be presenting on work when she was directly employed by St. Helena. So she worked out there for about 4.5 years, from 2012 through to 2014, on one of the world's most isolated islands. And I remember reading your significance article thinking, that's just fascinating. I'd love to get you in for a talk to the RSS audience. So I'll hand over to you.
Well, thank you ever so much, Bex. I'm so excited to be here. Thank you for inviting me along. I'm now in a position where I get to talk about one of the most fantastic places in the world. Not that I'm a little biased, but that's St. Helena. And we're just going to take a little bit of time today to talk about what it's like to live and work on one of the most isolated islands in the world. As Bex was saying, islands are fascinating. They've got a level of detail and complexity there that can be missed. We're talking about a world of big data. And when we're starting to talk about islands, we need to be looking at such intricacies and such detail and difficulties that it gives us a new approach on this, how we produce statistics, how we present, and the sorts of statistics that we need to be publishing. So we're going to start at the beginning by working out exactly where it is we're talking about. This is St. Helena, not St. Helens, not St. Helier, as I've had many confusions about over the years, but St. Helena, which is a small island in the middle of the South Atlantic. We have a picture of it up the top there, and a flag, just to show that it really is a place. I'm not making this island up. So over the next 20 minutes, I'm going to introduce you to the island. I'm going to give you some context for the sorts of work that we do there. If you've not seen these small islands, it can be difficult to understand the complexities of working there. And I'm just going to try and cover some of the most important things that I learned whilst working there. So, talking about answering the most important questions, when talking about one of the most isolated islands in the world, we'll start with the first one, which is, where is it? So, St. Helena, I'm going to have to step away here, so do I need to switch microphone? Yes. Yeah. Is that okay? You can still hear me? Okay. So, we're talking about St. Helena, and if I use my little doofer here, we have the little red flag showing the island. It's in the middle of the South Atlantic. I've helpfully pointed out where you are right now, up here, Glasgow. So it's quite a long way away, a few thousand miles. Giving you another point of reference, we have here the little green dot is Cape Town, which is the main port of access to the island, and that's just over 2,000 miles away. In terms of isolation, nearest point of land is between Angola and Namibia, and that's a mere 1,500 miles away, so relatively close, and then another couple of thousand miles on to Brazil. So as I said, St. Helena is a British overseas territory. It's part of a territory with Ascension, which is the little dot up here, 800 miles to the northwest, and Tristan da Cunha, which is approximately 1,500 miles to the south. So what should be sticking out from looking at these maps? That one of the things that makes St. Helena, I can just put this down there? Yeah, sorry, a bit new to all this Mikey stuff. St. Helena is physically isolated. It takes a long time to get there. We're a few thousand miles away from the nearest landmass. But what does that mean for the island? Now, one of the reasons that St. Helena has been best known to date is as a place of exile. One of the island's most famous residents was Napoleon. He was banished there after the Battle of Waterloo, when the British government thought, you've escaped from elsewhere, we're not taking any chances this time round, we'll put you on the island and hopefully nobody will come and get you, which indeed they didn't. Well, they did, but that was a couple of decades after he died. We're okay with that. And there have been other prisoners that have been put there. If you have a small island that is so physically isolated, it's a good place to banish people to. But that's not why I ended up there. I went there willingly. It's also strategically important. We don't think about these things so much anymore, but islands give us a place in the world that otherwise nations don't have. So St. Helena's actually been fought over. It was very important, the pre-Suez Canal, when we're looking at shipping routes taking from Europe around to the Indian Ocean and into Asia and beyond. St. Helena was vital as a navigational point and also as a point of refuge. This is where ships would stop to refuel, stock up on fresh water and produce before continuing their arduous journey. But the thing that remains so important about St. Helena now, when you have these physically isolated locations, is that you end up with very unique environments. We see things there that we don't see generally elsewhere in the world. Both the terrestrial and marine environments are so unique. The island is originally volcanic, but it's evolved in isolation from the rest of the world. So we see a lot of species endemics that we don't see anywhere else in the world. They're similar, but just a little bit different, like ferns that suddenly grow 6 meters high, and daisy trees and birds that you won't see elsewhere. And it also fills an ecological niche, which other areas don't. So there's whale sharks will come here. We've just found out it's a mating ground for them, which hasn't been discovered elsewhere. Humpback whales will come to have their babies because it is a safe refuge in the otherwise hectic world. And it all makes for a very special little island, which is why I want to talk to you more about it. So this is where it is. We know where it is now. We're starting to get a feel for the environment. So how do we get there? So until 2016, the only way to get there was by ship. And on the top right-hand side of the picture there, you see the main port of access to the island, which is the Royal Mail ship St. Helena. It's a pretty swift trip, maybe 5 nights from Cape Town. Or if we're going on to Ascension, it's another 3 nights, and from there you can get one of the twice-weekly flights back to the UK. And from 1990 to 2012, everything either arrived or left the island on the RMS, apart from a few yachts who would pass by. I'm going to step back again. Special ship, I want to introduce you to it. You spend that much time on it, you get to be very fond of it. So at the front of the ship, you can see I've lost there we go. See containers, these are 25-metre containers. They'll get offloaded onto little barges. The barges will be driven up towards the wharf. We can't dock against the wharf, we haven't got that, but we have cranes, so they're then craned ashore. People, you walk down this little ladder there, and again you then step onto a small boat, which will take you the last couple of 100 metres, where you can step in the footprints of Napoleon and walk up the wharf. If you're less nimble-footed, don't worry about it. You can come off the same way as the cargo, quite literally, in a people cage. Fortunately, you never had to do that. So as I said, this was the only way on or off the island in 2012. What changed then? Well, this is when we started work on one of the largest infrastructure projects the island has ever seen, which was the airport. Construction of it was finished in 2016. It has taken a little while to iron out some of the issues to do with scheduled flights. Stepping back again, you can see here, there's the Boeing 737 coming into land. This is the calibration flight that took part last April. We have the runway coming down here, and the more observant amongst you will have noticed that there's this little feature here, which is a 400-metre cliff. So it's not the easiest of landings, and unsurprisingly, this being the first landing of a large plane on the island, there was a bit of a wobble, and it's taken a little while to actually iron out some of those difficulties of getting the large planes onto the island. Small planes have still been coming and going over the last year. We've had 40 or so flights, including 8 medevac flights, which are quite literally a lifesaver. We talked about the 5 nights, 6 days down to Cape Town, which is the nearest point to go and get specialist medical care. We're considering, you imagine now yourself or one of your family members is critical ill. You need that level of specialist support. If the fit ship happens to be in port, you're a week away. That's happening maybe twice a month. So other than that, you're waiting for a ship to get to you. You can be days away from medical care versus on a plane, you're hours. And it has had a massive impact for the island. So what do you find when you actually get to the island, be it by plane or be it by ship? What do you find when you get there? I think you find one of the most beautiful and extraordinary places in the world. The island itself measures 10 miles long, 5 miles high, with the highest peak standing just over 800 metres. So it's a sort of small, squat. It's been referred to as a wart, but you might think of it as a little gem, a little jewel, but it's a short, squat little island. We have, as with many islands, incredibly diverse terrain. We go from very rocky shores to volcanic ash fields, incredibly steep hills. Looking at this map here, it's not the best one, sorry, I stole it. This little wiggly lines going all around the island are the roads. So as you can probably see, we haven't got terrain very well, but we've got these very steep valleys, very tight hairpin bends, which you learn to navigate quite expertly if you spent any time on island. At the top of the island, we have tropical rainforest, and in between we have rolling green hills, which you might expect to see anywhere in the English countryside. The island is home to approximately 4,500 people, just over 4,000 of which are islanders, St. Helenians, known as saints. These are British citizens. They're English-speaking, although they do have a very strong accent and quite a patois, as you expect with isolated populations. As well as physically evolving in isolation, the language evolves in very special ways. Again, as you might expect from such an isolated place, people are welcoming. They're pleased to see you, they make you feel at home there, and they're resilient. They're used to coping with things by themselves, making the best of what's available. Leads to this flexibility and resilience that we all crave so much of at the moment. Ethnicity-wise, it's just a melting pot. It's a perfect blend of white, black African, Chinese, Indian. Put those people together, leave them for a couple of 100 years, and we just end up with this massive spectrum. Ethnicity means nothing on the island. You're a saint. That's what matters. So, it's a small island. It's a contained population. We all know the difficulties of doing official statistics. I bet you're saying that must be an easy job. Not really. The island has no postal service, it doesn't have an address system. So actually tracking people down can be quite tricky, working out, well, who's here? Where do I find you? Before I can count you, before I can ask you the questions, how can I find you? Again, with a lot of islands, you find when we have administrative records that work well, they are excellent. So births and deaths, we have maybe 20 or 30 a year. So we can count them well, we can count them accurately. Same with immigration. If you've got one ship, you know exactly where people are going, we can tick you on off the island quite easily. So when that works well, it works fantastically. But there are gaps in the admin records, these things fall apart, so it's good to a point. And then errors, when they sneak in, they become catastrophic. If you think in the UK, if we were trying to count the population and we'd lost maybe 50, 100 people, we'd think, bang on, got that right. That 100 people on the island suddenly becomes a significant issue. So we've got some issues, we've got things to work around, we talk about the remoteness again. So when we decide to do things right, as with the census or household surveys, we're not just going to count the easy to finds, we need to count everyone. And so we end up with a fieldwork exercise that involves cars, Land Rovers, walking boots. I never need ropes, but that's the sort of terrain that we're looking at. So it wasn't me doing all this work by myself. I had my team with me. Let me introduce those to you. So this is the St. Helena Statistics Office. Let me step out again because I want to introduce you to them because I'm very proud of them. So we have here Natasha, Kelly, and Justine, and we're all dressed up here for World Stats Day. Because, you know, I want these people to love their jobs as much as I did. So we spent a lot of time on island talking about how wonderful statistics are, pulling on the resources and inspiring them. And what better to inspire people other than giving them a lovely, pretty T-shirt. So that's my core stats team. As I said, we did a census last year, and at that point, we almost doubled our team size. And down here we have the census team. So you'll see we've got Kelly and Justine again. We've lost Natasha. She went off to work elsewhere in government, spreading the way of stats, which is good, propagating our art. And then we have Gareth and Brendan, who joined us temporarily. Now, we operated out of the castle in Jamestown. This is the seat of government. And it is literally a castle. We don't have turrets, but I promise you, it's a 16th century castle. And we talked about stepping ashore. If you can see up here, these little cranes, those are the steps that we take onto St. Helena. So, I'm showing you who we are and where we work from. So, what do we do? So we were responsible for all the government stats for the island, from data collection, analysis, publication and dissemination. We produce the usual core statistics, so we have price indices, population estimates, income and so on. We collate information from other government departments and provide them. Part of my role whilst I was there was, as well as collating it, I wanted to help them improve as much as my office. So I was given the support with data management, analysis, using that phrase that, and just to give you an idea of the level that we're coming from, a lot of my first contact involved phrases such as, have you thought of using a spreadsheet? Which can suddenly have these massive leaps in terms of accessibility and wonderful things start to happen. And then we also do the typical one-off exercises that statisticians do, living standards, expenditures, and the census, and so on. We're doing all the hard work, but the point about it is that it's going to be used, but I'll talk about that in a minute. I just want to sort of talk again about one of the big picture things that I got whilst I was there, and that was to do with capacity building. I was there as something called a technical cooperation officer, which means there was a gap in the island's skill base. They were doing well, but they didn't have a qualified statistician. They'd never had a qualified statistician. DFID used to provide people. They used to send them to the island, and the island's transitioning towards independence, so now they just fund these posts. So I went there as a technical cooperation officer, and part of your job there is to do yourself out of a job. If you've done it well, you don't need to be replaced because you've made somebody local, you brought them up to that level where they can carry on doing the work without you. We had a wonderful team on island, incredibly experienced but lacking in qualifications. And so we have to work in quite a different way with them. We have to think differently. And this is an important point, that we can get stuck into the people we work with and the ways that we work. But when we go to these more remote situations, we need to think a little more carefully about what we need to do, how we need to get there, and the best way of achieving it. And what we find is that people with a lot of experience, you bring a little bit of technical support into place, and wonderful things start to happen. Sorry, excuse me. So we invest in training, we invest in awareness, and as with the T-shirts, we invest in making them proud in their job so that they're dedicated to what they do and not tempted to just go where the money is. So we're doing the training, we're producing the work, and we also need to be thinking about improving the range of statistics on the island. As I said, I joined the island at one of the most important periods in her history. We're about to go from being so isolated. I need to speed up. Sorry, I'm getting too excited about this. I needed to make sure the stats were being used. So how do we do that? We talk about them. One of the most important points about statistics is communicating them. I have here just a picture showing there are two newspapers on island and 2 radio stations. My first publication, I was terrified. I thought, what are the media going to do to me? And they did the worst thing possible. They ignored me. I was producing all these wonderful statistics and nobody cared. So I realised I needed to take a massive change of approach. I needed to make it work. And just as the RSS has invested so much in working with the media and working with the public to get them using them, I needed to follow in those footsteps. So you start writing press releases differently. The Independent loved it. They can pick it up, they can print it exactly. Sentinel, they like to be original. So you write articles for them to publish, and it works. But it's not enough to expect people to read these things. As Robert was saying earlier, we put the information out there, but we can't just expect people to engage. So we need to start talking about them. So I spent a lot of time on radio. Radio is very important on the island. Just about all households, well, every household will have one. It will be on most of the day. That's your source to information, news, local gossip. That's where we go. So we move towards planned interviews. We get out there and we talk about our statistics. And we keep talking until people start to understand. I also spent a lot of time listening in to what was being said and taking a big step forward. When you hear somebody misrepresenting your stats, you drop into the studio. Let me put you right about that. Would you like to talk about this some more? Challenging those grumbles, making sure the statistics were understood was absolutely vital. And also, that then made me better in my role, because it helped me make sure that my statistics were relevant to people's lives. And it helped me make sure that I could explain it in ways that people understood. Not what I thought they should understand, but what they actually got. And it was difficult, but I persevered and it worked. And just to say about social media, that doesn't work on Ireland. We have very low levels of internet access, and that again was a lesson in picking the right tool for the situation. So what was the point of all this? It was all to do with making an impact. And raising the quality and profile of the statistics on St Helena had a positive impact on everyone living there. Whether or not they recognise it, it did. As I said, I joined the island at one of the most important periods in our history. We're looking at onset of air access, a step change for the island, both economically and socially. I've alluded to it, but I haven't said, but St Helena is a British aid dependency. Approximately 60% of the running costs of the island are met through British budgetary support. And when it comes to infrastructure projects, we're entirely reliant on the UK to fund them. We have a massive age dependency ratio. If we come back here, we've got the age-sex diagram at the top, and age of dependency at the bottom. It's one of the highest ratios in the world, and when we look at the population projections, it's not a pretty sight. And so we need to improve the fortunes of the island. We attract people back to the island to live, work, have babies, raise their families, contribute to the economy, and all this will lead to the decreased reliance on budgetary aid, which is why DFID agreed to fund the airport project. They provide the funds. Responsibility for success lies with these 12 people, pictured up here. They are 12 individuals that make up Legislative Council, which is the equivalent of members of Parliament, and then we have committee chairs that will be your cabinet. As I say, they're 12 individuals, they're not trained politicians, there are no party politics, and how do we bring them together? We bring them together with a solid evidence base for their decision making, which are impartial, accessible, timely statistics on the topics that matter to them. They're enabling discussion, they're empowering decision-making, and they're providing accountability on both sides, both to councillors for their decisions and to government for following through. And where does this lead to? It's leading to better planning, better resource allocation. Through the census, we've emphasised the need to step up elderly care services and social housing. And we've managed to challenge something that happens, I think it happens everywhere, but particularly in small places, which is common knowledge. Everybody knows how things are until you present them with reliable statistics that prove it's not quite like that. As I think our favourite man has said, that the facts are not up for dispute. The facts are the facts. Argue amongst yourselves after that. And so this is a story about access to good information. Time on the small island was not about complex analysis. We didn't have time for it. The most basic stats had a massive impact, presenting a solid evidence base to enable that policymaker to make informed decisions. Duck to water doesn't always happen, but you can try. We provide accountability to the UK for funding decisions, showing that UK's tax money is actually being used to benefit the population. And something that I'm sure the next two speakers will also pick up on, that we have to do this and we have to do it right, because small islands are so underrepresented in the large data sets that we so typically use. We can't model, we can't skip over it. We have to go there and we have to measure them so well. So, and I promise, I'm going to meet my target here. I'm moving on. I'm now leaving the island. So last year, After 4 years on the island, we made the decision to come back to the UK. St Helena is a wonderful place. I was incredibly lucky to be allowed to stay there, but it's difficult to be so far away from home, from family. I have a young daughter. She'd grown up without grandparents because it is so difficult to visit. And I was lucky enough, having got a thirst for working with development context, I was lucky enough to get a post with DFID, doing very different work, but no less satisfying. Future for the island is also looking very bright. So that much maligned airport, simply saving lives. We've got scheduled flights starting on the 14th of October. £800 return to Johannesburg, so you can book early for Christmas. And also a sneaky credit there to the other future, which is the future of the Statistics Office, who's Neil Phantom, that I'm thinking some of you will have heard of, ex-DFID, worked for the World Bank, has now taken over as statistician and will be the best man to lead them into the future. But looking forward, I can't do that without just looking back a little. And as I've said, St Helena was wonderful. I had amazing times living there, but it can be tough. In terms of personal support, I had my family with me. But I was quite isolated professionally. I was out there by myself. And it's not a position I'd ever been in before. I'm used to working with large organisations. I'd come from working for ONS. We've got the infrastructure, we've got the team in place. And to suddenly find yourself working by yourself is difficult. And this, for me, is where the RSS came in. I'd always known that professional societies were important, but I hadn't realised how important. You're a route back to advice and support. I'm awash with a sea of options, and the RSF you gave me that route back to a reliable way to work out what I needed to do, to help me work out what to do on island, how to do it, and also how to talk about it, how to explain it to people. So I'm going to finish now with a thank you to the RSS, and a thank you to you all for listening today, and as a reward, you can have some pictures of the island while you ask questions. Thank you.
I'm conscious of time here, but if anyone on the floor, I can happy to take a quick question now, but I'm sure Paula's more than happy to talk to people at the end of this session on any things you may wish to discuss. Any questions from the floor?
Well, sorry, the only issue I think is how to deal with confidentiality.
You have to step back over. In terms of, well, you have to just be incredibly careful. You have to earn people's trust. It's not enough to be able to say, we have strict confidentiality guidelines. It's that you really have to get people to trust you, and I have to trust my team. So when we're dealing with confidential information, things are difficult. We have to think strategically about knowing that they know this is not something we talk about at all, knowing that this is information that relates to their auntie, friends, mothers, whatever. They know the people in the data. And then also myself being a little removed means I can make a sort of judgment call about whether or not this is information that I give to person A, person B, or deal with myself. And then take a creative approach to disclosure control. Thank you.
Right, thank you very much. I'd like to introduce my second speaker, who is Mackin from the NHS Western Isles. When I was thinking about small island statistics, okay, we have Paula's example of one of the remotest islands in the world, but also, no matter where we take the RSS conference, every devolved nation or country has its own islands. So we've also got some inherent issues around small island statistics very close to home. So Max is going to be presenting around some of the benefits and challenges of small area data in the Western Isles, and she works particularly in the local intelligence support team covering health and social care and also primary care.
Thanks very much, Bex, and thank you for allowing me the opportunity to tell you a little bit about what I do in the Western Isles and how small area data can actually be of benefit to all. So about the Western Isles, as you can see, I've included a map of Scotland. Most of you if you're based in the UK, will have seen or vaguely seen the Western Isles before. It's usually covered by the wind arrows or the rain on the BBC forecast. So it's actually a group of 6 main islands with a further 11 that are uninhabited. And it stretches 130 miles from the tip at Portness all the way down to Barra. So current population estimates are 26,900. So it's a little bit larger than St. Helena. And in terms of our rurality, we're currently the second most rural area in Scotland with a population density of 0.09 persons per hectare. Now, against the Scottish average, that's 0.65, and across the whole of Europe, as an average of 1.1. So it gives you an idea of how sparsely populated we are and the challenges around that. So my role is strategic and operational data analysis. So in other words, providing operational data for both the health and social care teams. Again, I don't do this in isolation. I do this with, alongside my colleagues in health intelligence and social care, and providing data for census and also for national returns. Other role is development of additional data sets. So, as probably all aware, we're regularly required to produce additional data as new policies and areas of interest come on stream. So one of the things that I normally do is look at how we can collect and ensure that we're collecting concise and accurate information. This also involves data capture design, particularly when we're looking at funding initiatives. So working with frontline staff to develop how we're going to capture the data. And data education, which is something that Paula had also touched upon. While the majority of people that I work with are quite au fait with data, in terms of how data can benefit them, we find that there are some gaps. So one of the things in particular is how official statistics and data that we are returning can actually be used and modified to support their ambitions, to support their objectives, particularly around areas in health and social care, where decisions have to be made on resource allocation, on policy, and how we're going to look toward the future. So the advantages of being small. Proximity to influencers. One of the advantages that I have is that I speak to chief executives, I speak to senior managers, I also work with clinical staff. So I have the opportunity to actually find out what their particular agendas are, what areas they wish to work upon, without having to go through various committees and layers to actually get to the crux of the information that they require. One of the advantages of working with smaller data is being able to identify outliers. It's quite easy to identify some of the pieces that have a significant adverse influence on the data that we're working with. So, as an example, looking at long-term conditions and the amount of time people were spending in hospital, we identified that there was one particular year where there seemed to be a massive increase to in excess of 3,000 bed days. And when we traced that back, that was as a result of 2 individuals who had actually been hospitalised for over a year. Now, working with big data sets and many rows of data would have been a lot harder to identify. We had the luck and also the advantage of being small and being able to quickly identify that before it was actually presented and used by influencers and decision makers. One of the other advantages is seeing your data turn into action. So at that point, The data I've been working on and presenting has then been used by various teams to make decisions on what actions they're going to take, whether it's introducing a new service or looking at resourcing models. I can actually see that through to its conclusion and to determine whether it actually has or has not been accurate and been a success. Breadth of experience. Again, small numbers of staff. So as you heard, I work in health and social care and also primary care as well now. That means that I have the opportunity to work on so many different things, which means that every day is different and it's also vastly interesting. Because I live there, I'm invested in the outcomes of the data that's been produced and how it's been used to make decisions. So again, while you remain impartial, you are always conscious that the information you're providing is going to impact on your family, on your friends, and on you yourself. So you do take care, additional care, to ensure that you are as accurate as possible. Ability to act quickly. We're quite fortunate in having access to senior all the way through to those that are actually going to be implementing the actions. It means that we can act a little bit faster. As I said, it means that we've got less hurdles in terms of going from decision maker to implementation. Moving on, when small is an obstacle, there's always an obstacle. Generating sample sizes. So you've received a tranche of funding, you need to evidence that the work that you've done has actually been a success. And yes, you know, common sense says feedback from your service users, from your clinical staff say, yep, it's been a really big success. But when you go to statistically evidence this, you may find that your sample sizes don't provide you with sufficient data. Again, going back to the question that was asked there about maintaining confidentiality, yes, that's a challenge. Not so much in terms of our statistical process control. Again, there are various things that we do in terms of rounding, but certainly in terms of working with other organisations and maybe with colleagues who are requesting data. So they may very well request information and say, well, I want to know how many people in this area have this condition or receive this service. And while it's a very reasonable request, there are times when we do have to say, we can't provide that to you in the way you want it, because we need to maintain the individual's confidentiality. Again, this is a challenge with small data sets and small populations. Specialist skills. Quite often we'll get asked for something which on the surface looks relatively easy and relatively common to do, and then another question gets asked. At that point you realise that they're actually looking for something that is highly specialised. Again, you don't have a huge team to fall back upon and to request the support of. Turning information into action can also be a challenge at times. You make a really interesting assessment, you can see a direction of travel that you need to go in. Unfortunately, to do so, the best course of action is going to require significant funding or significant resource. We're working with tighter budgets and smaller resource pool. So there are times when the best option isn't always the most viable option. The challenge of national measures. I've included a graph here showing the balance of care, the percentage of people over the age of 65 with long-term care needs who are receiving 10 plus hours care at home. This is a standard piece of data that's produced year on year from both health and social care sources. As you can see there, the provisional data for 2016 indicates that there's been a substantial drop in the Western Isles. The reason for that is that there has been a very, very small change to how one piece of data has been recorded, and it's only a change of 10 points within the actual number of records, and yet that is the impact that that can have on how our data looks. Without the context, a decision maker could look at that and go, oh, they need to up their game. They're not performing well here, when actually, on first impression, it may very well be misleading. So again, sensitivity of the small numbers, measure design. Again, we have to work with what works for the majority of the population, but we do need to be mindful when we're working with small data and when we're working in small areas that the significance of how a measure has been designed may very well paint a picture that has been observed by decision makers that isn't 100% accurate without including the context. The level of effort. When requesting data at a national level, irrespective of whether you're working with 100 records, 1,000, or even 100,000 records, the level of effort required to write that syntax, design the query, manipulate the data is the same, but you may have a much smaller resource pool to actually do that. Or it may very well be that you'll require a new data capture system, which, investment-wise, you don't actually have the same leverage in a small organisation as you do in a large. So, learning from small numbers. Issues identified by small area data can be upscaled for further investigation by other areas. For example, a piece of work that I'd been involved in was review of our care home population and how people ended up in care homes. What were their situations prior to entering into care homes? As we know, we've already got a significantly ageing population. In the Western Isles in particular, by 2037, we will be looking at nearly 40% of our population being over the age of 65 and all the inherent dependencies that we will potentially see there. So this for us was something quite important. One of the assumptions that's normally made is if somebody has an unpaid carer close to them, somebody providing support alongside other forms of community or home care, then chances are they're not going to go into a care home unless they have a long-term condition or another condition such as dementia, which means they can no longer be supported in the community. What we actually identified was that the presence of an unpaid carer does make a difference, but if the unpaid carer isn't actually living with that individual, even if they're living next door, if they're not living with that individual, the instance of people going into residential care was significantly higher. Again, relatively small numbers and hopefully of interest to other areas, provides the potential for other areas that maybe have larger cohorts to investigate further to establish whether there really is some significance in there. The ability to implement and deploy rapidly, so the test to change cycle, we're quite lucky in that we can implement and deploy relatively quickly on certain types of tests of change. So again, there have been a number of pieces of work that we've done that have allowed us to do a small test cycle to then be able to feed out potentially to larger areas. So, in conclusion, according to the ONS, the Western Isles was the happiest place in the UK. So, stats says I live in a really happy, good place. And as you can see, that particular picture has been taken on one of the 8 days of the year. We actually have a little bit of sunshine and no wind or rain. So I hope you've enjoyed the information and also all the pictures of the Western Isles that I've included there as well. And I'd just like to thank you for taking the time to attend, and also to thank various people who have contributed directly and indirectly to the presentation. Thank you very much.
What I'd like to do is take this into the final presentation, where we've been fortunate to have Ali McLeod from the Scottish Government come here to present today. And what's quite key is he works in the area of the Scottish Indices of Mass Deprivation. For those of you that were there at the RSS Awards, this actually won the RSS Statistical Excellence Award this year, in particular looking at bringing real life to the statistics to serve the community. And they've also won the Scottish Government Communicating Statistics Award. So he's going to be looking at how some of this small island data is then used and incorporated into larger data sets.
Thank you very much for inviting me along today. I want to just talk about the Scottish Index of Multiple Deprivation. I'm sure there's plenty of people that know what that is, just in case you don't. SIMD is the Scottish Government's official tool for finding areas of deprivation in Scotland. The important thing there is it's the official tool, not the only tool. And we keep saying, use SIMD with other data and it'll bring the data to life and you'll be able to see real examples of how you can, real analysis that you can actually start to solve problems with. But what ends up happening is that SIMD points to Glasgow in the west of Scotland and says, there's all the deprived areas, and everybody outside of Glasgow in the west of Scotland says, well, what use is SIMD for me? It doesn't tell me much about my area. So one of the reasons why we won the award, I think, is because what we've actually done is make people realise that SIMD can speak to their areas as well, and not just the more urban-centred areas. And so we also get a lot of criticism from people in rural Scotland, down south, and up north, and on the islands, that say, well, SIMD just doesn't tell us. We've not, in Orkney, Western Isles and Shetland, we don't have any areas that are deprived. And what I'm going to show you today is, no, you don't have any areas that are the most deprived in Scotland, but you still have relative deprivation in those islands. And what we can do is, if we bring together their data sources, start to tease out some of the issues. So the issue that I want to talk about is quite important for us at the moment, which is the Child Poverty Bill, which is going through Parliament at the moment. It's through stage 2 at the moment, about to go to stage 3. It's got cross-party support. Everybody's going to say, nobody's going to say that tackling child poverty is a bad idea. So, you know, they all think that this is a good idea. I'm not here to debate the policy or anything like that, but just how can we support it as we start to develop that into actual deliverable, measurable actions to tackle child poverty. So the first thing that we need to do is identify where child poverty exists across Scotland. And if you're sitting in Renfrewshire Council, you know where child poverty exists. You probably are already tackling that. If you're in Orkney or Shetland and you don't have much analytical resource, and you talked about not having the specialised services to do some of that work, how do you know where the child poverty exists? How are you going to measure the work that you're going to do as we try to get to tackling child poverty in 2030 and meeting the national targets that will be set? So we need to start planning for how are we going to implement that. So we need to identify it, and then we need to plan how are we going to measure the impact of those policies, and do we get to the target. So first of all, SIMD, probably a lot of you have seen this already. SIMD shows you that not all deprived people live in deprived areas, and this is looking specifically at income deprivation. If you're looking at poverty, 1 in 3 people who are income deprived live in a deprived area. That's not to say that SIMD doesn't work. What we're saying is that deprivation takes more characteristics than just looking at poverty. And 1 in 3 people over the whole index don't live in a, 2 in 3 people, sorry, don't live in a deprived area. So it leads us to say that not all people who are deprived live in deprived areas. So if you go out to Shetland or you go to Orkney, there will be deprived people living in those areas that look like they're not deprived. The problem with the rurality is that, you know, settlements less than 3,000 people, so small towns, villages with no connections to other larger areas, 1 in 5 of the population in Scotland live in one of those sort of smaller areas. So we need to identify where those people are. And if we're looking specifically at child poverty, then we're not going to be able to just use SIMD and say, well, look at where these areas are. We need to use other data. So what are the risk factors that contribute to child poverty? And so I brought an intern into the team, and she did some work over 4 or 5 months looking at exactly this. And a bit of desk research to start with, it just said, looking at some of the stuff from JRF and other sources saying, right, children who are in poverty, children who are at risk of being in poverty are going to be living in households where there's lone parents, or there's going to be people who are in that household who are not in employment, or there could be long-term illness and disability within that household. Already I'm starting to think, well, that sounds like census data to me. I think we've got a solution here that we can take forward. And then what we did was we said, right, well, let's look at the number of children who are living in the islands that are in poverty. And you can see the Scotland average, we've got 26% children in poverty, according to the Poverty and Income Inequalities report that the Scottish Government reported in March this year. But if you look at the End Child Poverty report, which is another useful source, you see it's much lower in those islands. So in Shetland, Orkney, Helena and Shah, it's much smaller. 10.6, 14.1, 17.6. That's not to say that those people are not important. We still need to be tackling some of the issues that affect those places. So what does SIMD say about these areas? Well, you can start off by seeing SIMD, we're starting at SIMD quintile 2, so that's the people who are in the 20 to 40% most deprived. We're not looking at the 20% most deprived because that doesn't happen in the islands. That's not to say that these people don't matter, that they're not deprived. SIMD is all about relative deprivation. So if we're about relative deprivation within the islands, let's look at the most relatively deprived areas within the islands. So what we can see is that, and I'm going to concentrate on Orkney because that's what we did the case study on, but we're starting to replicate that for the other islands and for the other rural areas across Scotland and some of the very rural highland areas. But we can see in Orkney that the South Isles and Hoy in particular is quite deprived. A small part of Kirkwall, and the smallest data zone that Orkney has. West Kirkwall is also one of the most deprived data zones. And then the North Isles, which encompasses the town Sandy, which services a lot of those islands, there's a lot of deprivation there. That's the most deprived areas in Orkney. So we've started by identifying where the most deprived areas are in SIMD. So if what we're trying to do is enable the islands to develop policy, we're not going to start doing new statistics. Let's look at what's already publicly available so we can replicate that across the country and people in the islands can get access to that and scrutinise that themselves. So we've sourced other area level data about child poverty that is publicly available and exploring those risk factors that I talked about. Just to quantify that for Orkney, so we went up to Orkney Council and presented this all to them, and I don't think we're as remote as St Helena, but I think what we did experience was probably the roughest plane journey I've ever been on in my life. We took off from Edinburgh in a small, I'll not tell you the company that we flew on, let's just call them Fly Maybe, and we coming into Orkney, and as we're coming into land, the pilot came across, and we'd gone twice around the island. The pilot came across the intercom and he said, for those of you that are regular on this flight, you'll know that we quite often circle the airport and land on maybe third or fourth attempt. He said, and that's usually because of wind. But today it's because the landing gear hasn't come down. So we're just going over the sea, we'll fix it and we'll be coming into land just shortly. Now that the cockpit door opens, the co-pilot comes out, lifts the floorboard next to my seat and starts winding a handle. And I look out and I can see the North Sea down there. It was one of the most frightening experiences of my life, but also one of the most enjoyable because the complimentary tea and coffee comes with a Tunnocks tea cake or a caramel log. So we went up to Orkney and we presented this to them and we said, right, okay, so where are your deprived areas? Here they are. And we presented it to the Community Planning Partnership, and you could start to see them starting to go, well, SIMD doesn't really talk to us. And we started to talk about, well, here's the other data sources. So starting off with the End Child Poverty Report, which in the End Child Poverty Report, they did talk about the islands, so they like it. So we started to say, right, here's the most deprived areas for child poverty, or here's the areas where children in poverty live, the sort of North Islands, South Islands, a wee bit in Kirkwall as well. So we can start to say, right, SIMD looks like, if you look at other data sources, but we're in the right ballpark area. There they are, just side by side. You can see that the chloropleth looks almost similar across both. But you can actually delve into that data a wee bit further. HMRC provides that data at data zone level, and again, you start to pick out the same areas, although the South Isles and Hoy doesn't really get picked up there. So it is a murky picture. It's not perfect, but we're starting to see, right, these are where the areas are that we think you need to maybe concentrate on. Now we can go into output areas, and that's where I think the census starts to come in. And I know the census goes out of date, but I think it's still relevant. It's just identifying where the risk factors are for child poverty. We're not saying that's where everybody in Orkney, where all children that are in poverty live, but we're saying if you're wanting to concentrate efforts, this is a good starting point. And if you want to measure progress as you start to do that, then it would be good to look at these areas. So the South Isles, we can split that up into output areas, and South Isles is split up into about 4 or 5 output areas. Kirkwall West itself is 6 different output areas, and then the North Isles, I think again it's about 4 or 5. We can start to quantify those data zones to see how many children are living there out of the total population. And then what we started to do was say, right, okay, so we've seen that. Let's look at the North Isles, and let's look at some of the census output area there. And we can see that 20 families there with lone parent households. But the area around Sandy Airport seems to be standing out a wee bit there. Now with census data, we've talked about disclosure control, there's record swapping. So we're not saying that this is perfect. We're not saying that we can identify all the people there, because we won't. We've got record swapping, so we've dealt with that issue. So just in case you think that it's Mrs. Brown that's sitting there, then, and people in Orkney do know who live in these communities, and when you talk about census output area, you could start identifying people. So we are aware of that, but we're saying that forget about the individuals, just looking at the kind of where is the biggest concentration. We think it's around Sandy Airport. Looking at the South Isles, 156 children living in the South Isles, and we looked there at people who were not in employment, and it was Longhope and Linus in the South Isles. So we said, we think there might be something going on there. And then just looking at Kirkwall itself, looking at the number of households with at least one person long-term illness. And we could start to pick out areas in West Kirkwall where we think that might be a bit of a problem. When you put all those maps together, you can start to see these are where we think the problems are. And we presented this to the Community Planning Partnership, and at that point you kind of think, well, how are we going to get on there? And there was an elected member sitting in the CPP that day that we were presented to. And similarly, I think it was the same report about it was the happiest place to be. I think Orkney was up there as well. And he thumped his fist on the table and said, you're telling me that there's children in poverty. That's not what I know. Again, you spoke about that a second ago. That's not what I understand. We're the happiest place to live. We're the best place to live, apparently. And thankfully, I had some people at the back of the Community Planning Partnership who work in housing and working in outreach services. And they said that's exactly where we think the problems are. So we're not trying to tell people where the problems are, because they probably do know where it is. But what we're trying to do is help people evidence where those problems are and say that these are the issues, these are the areas where we think the highest issues are going. And we seem to have got a bit of traction with that. We published this, and similarly, what's the worst thing that can happen when you publish data? Media ignore you. And we got complete ignorance to that. In fact, when we published this, they picked up on a minor point about fuel poverty in Dumfries and Galloway, and actually what we said in our report was you can't tell anything from SIMD or other data sources about fuel poverty. That's what they picked up, forgot about Orkney. But we seem to have picked up a bit of traction with that, and I know that Orkney Council are now using that. So I think that in summary, what we were trying to really say is that, yeah, we know that there are problems with disclosure control. Yes, we know that there are problems with the small numbers not being enough, and there's been plenty of literature about that. But I think when you do start to combine the data sources together, I think you can start to build up a richer picture, and that can be used for policy development, and we're currently doing that as we go forward in the child measurement framework for the Child Poverty Bill. So I hope that's kind of, I know we've just talked about child poverty, but I hope I've maybe seeded a few other thoughts about how you can use SIMD with other data as well for possibly other research projects that you might have going on. So thank you very much.